Hello, everyone. This is the video for chapter 23. This is on World War II. Here's our essential question for the unit. For this chapter. How did World War II transform the U.S. domestically and change its relationship with the world? So in this first part of the chapter, we look at what led the United States to go to war. A lot of this information early on is background information that most likely would not be on the APUSH exam. So I'll go over it here in this video, but is not something that we would normally talk about very much in class. It's not something that would most likely be on the unit test or even the national exam. But it's good background information, especially for students who did not take world history in their 9th grade. So when we look at the decade of the 1930s, around the world, we see various types of fascist movements. The three main examples we see during this time period are Japan, Italy, and Germany, with increasing totalitarian leaders that depend on fear and political dominance in order to rule. So in Japan, we see an increased desire for more power, more control over Eastern Asia. And so to gain that power, Japan needed more raw materials, needed to take over different areas that had these materials like oil. And so Japan began expanding around eastern and northern China to different islands of the Pacific Ocean. And when it did so and was criticized by other countries, it decided to leave the League of Nations and never return. We see a similar thing happen in Italy with a dictator named Benito Mussolini. He invaded Ethiopia, hoping to find raw materials there to use for his consolidation of power. And then, of course, there's Germany. Germany had faced a terrible economic depression with hyperinflation at the end of the 1920s. A feeling of disrespect and discouragement from the rest of the world after the Treaty of Versailles. And all of this led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. He defied the Treaty of Versailles and international agreements by rearming Germany and creating an alliance with Italy and Japan. Now, what we want to focus on specifically is the United States. What is the U.S.'s role in all of this? When do we get involved? How do we get involved? What are the different perspectives on during this time period? And what we see in the 1930s is this real avoidance or desire to avoid any European entanglements after World War I. That's kind of the word that was used, entanglements, that we definitely don't want to get involved with a war, but we don't want to get involved with any alliances or trade things that are going to draw us into war. After World War I, there's a fear that all the businesses and factories that created weapons and stuff you need for war had influenced us to join World War I, and really it was their fault we joined the war, and a fear that could happen again. And so Congress decided to basically portray or push our neutrality in a world environment that was increasingly leading to war. In 1935, we said we would not sell any weapons to countries who were at war. Then we said we wouldn't even give out loans to countries that were at war. Eventually, we did soften it a little bit when we have in 1937 a program that you should know called the Cash and Carry. It said, okay, we'll trade with countries who are at war if they want to buy non-military goods, and if they want to pay cash now, and if they carry them in their own ships. Remember, if you go back to World War I, one of the major reasons why we enter the war is because of US ships being blown up by German submarines. So this would really prevent the United States from being put in that same situation where we might get our ships blown up. So this is really done as a method to keep out of war, at least keep out of war like we did in World War I. And so we have many famous people who are against going to war. The most famous anti-war voice during this time is probably this man, Charles Lindbergh, who was probably one of the most famous men of the 1920s after flying across the Atlantic Ocean, the first to do so. And he was heavily against intervening in Europe. He joined a group called the America First Committee. So most Americans, like Charles Lindbergh, were isolationist. And while other countries are going to war, President Roosevelt, I think he sees that war is coming around the world and that America might have to go in, but he realizes that America's public is not there yet. They're not prepared or ready to go into war. Very few Americans at this point want to stand up to the growing fascism in Europe. Things will change a little bit in 1938 for, well, they'll change a lot in Europe when Hitler took over Austria and then threatened Czechoslovakia. And so Hitler was invited to go to a conference in Munich to meet with English and French leaders about this fear that Hitler might take over Czechoslovakia. Great Britain and France warned them that if you take over Czechoslovakia, it could lead to war. Eventually, they make a deal called appeasement, which says, okay, Germany, if you take over Czechoslovakia and that's it, we'll be fine. Okay, as long as you just take over Czechoslovakia, you're good. And Hitler said, yep, that's all I want, Czechoslovakia. And they let Germany take over Czechoslovakia. And he says, don't take any more land, otherwise we'll get really mad and we'll go to war. And lo and behold, Hitler and Stalin shocks the world. They sign an agreement that they are not going to fight in a war against each other, but instead will both invade Poland. And so when that happens, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany. So when this happens, what does the United States do? Well, Roosevelt says we would continue to be neutral. This is similar to what President Wilson said in World War I. He wanted Americans to be neutral then. However, Woodrow Wilson told the people to be neutral in thought as well as action. So we're going to be neutral as far as our actions, but also he called for Americans to be neutral in their thoughts. Don't think of either side of going to war. Roosevelt says, while our actions might be neutral right now, he couldn't force the people to be neutral in thought. So I think this is his beginning to say, okay, we might become neutral in the future, and kind of preparing people for that. And while most Americans support Great Britain and France, they don't want to join the war to fight alongside them. They know how deadly World War I was. They don't want it to happen again. Even when Germany would invade Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, and France. As far as democratic countries, only Great Britain is standing against Hitler. And so by this time, by the time we get to France being taken over, more Americans want to intervene and not be isolationist. It's not at a majority or anything like that, but some interventionists create groups to support our allies, wanting to bring weapons of war to those countries, which would be a violation of neutrality laws. I talked before about isolationists creating the American First Committee. And FDR is moving towards interventionism. He is calling for changes to neutrality laws, like trading destroyers to Great Britain. So destroyers like these in this picture here, giving these to Great Britain. These are tools of war, which would have violated the Neutrality Acts. They're beginning to change those to help our allies. Roosevelt is calling for more spending in defense factories. He is advocating for our neutrality laws to change so that we can become a great arsenal of democracy. An arsenal is a place where weapons are stored. So he kind of sees us as the storage place for the rest of the world's democracy to come to when they need help. We would provide those weapons. Amidst all of this, in 1940, Roosevelt runs for an unprecedented third term. Both want to support allies, both him and Wendell Willkie, the Republican, but neither want to enter the war. And FDR wins this third election. Roosevelt begins to increase his push to help Great Britain and try to advocate to the public for more help. His famous For Freedom speech, showing that in order to protect our freedom of speech, our freedom of religion, our freedom from want, our freedom from fear, we need to support the Allies. And so he, along with Congress, agreed to something called the Lend-Lease Act, which says we're going to make it easier for our allies to get weapons, where we say we can lend them weapons instead of outright selling it to them, if they're our allies. And then we even begin to lend weapons to Russia after Germany invaded them. By this time, Roosevelt sees war as inevitable. Since 1937, actions of Japan have led there to be a feeling that war could be inevitable in the Pacific. America doesn't want to intervene, even though Japan invades our ally China. Japan continues to expand around Southeast Asia, going beyond Chinese borders. And so we try to stop Japan by saying we're going to stop trading with them. We're going to freeze their assets. We're not going to give them oil anymore. And by this time, America's pretty sure it's going to be attacked. I think most thought the big attack was going to be in the Philippines. However, it actually takes place in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. And this one event is pretty much going to eliminate all calls for isolationism. America immediately plunges into war with overwhelming support. Here you can see some images of the destruction of that day. and Americans want revenge. Now, I mentioned before that America begins to increase our defense spending a couple of years before just Pearl Harbor. However, in order to meet the needs of a world war, we are not ready. We do not have the factories ready for this. We do not have the manpower or the weapons or the ships or the planes necessary for a world war. And so we need to get our stuff in gear, and we need to act. And so the government puts its full power into spending on new factories, new facilities that can produce the stuff for war. Because you can have the best strategies, the best generals. If you don't have the stuff in order to fight a war, you're going to lose. And so with increased spending comes factories growing. Those factories need new workers. Remember, we're still feeling effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment is around 10 to 15%. And so this is going to decrease unemployment dramatically. The government borrows a ton of money, more money than as ever borrowed before. More people pay taxes. Taxes raise, and even that is not enough. In fact, the government is going to have to borrow money from the people through the method of war bonds. So a person can buy a war bond for, let's say, $100, and after 10 years or so, they can exchange it with the government and get, I don't know, $1,000 back. So it's a bond. You make money by taking the bond, and the government takes your $100 and uses it for the war effort. And so the government is going to produce all the stuff for war using an organization called the War Production Board. Basically, they go to companies and say, okay, we need a plane company. And so they go to General Motors, who usually makes cars, and they say, we're going to give you this huge defense contract. You're going to transform your facility. We're going to pay for it. And then you're going to build us airplanes. And here they're building B-24 bombers. Okay, so they allocate resources and say, okay, we have this aluminum or we have this steel. We're going to ship this to you, and we're going to ship this aluminum to that company. They're going to make sure all the companies have all the resources they need to make the stuff. Car companies start making tanks. All these companies start transitioning from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. More than 16 million men and women would join the armed forces during World War II. Unfortunately, segregation is still around in the United States at the time. Despite this obvious discrimination and unfair systemic racism, more than 1 million African Americans still join up in the fight. Other groups of Americans also joined, including Native Americans and Mexican Americans, although the Army did not segregate them. One important group of influential Native Americans were code talkers. There's been movies and documentaries made about them. Basically, Native Americans would speak their native tongue. The most famous example of this is the Navajo, but other groups did this too, like the Choctaw. And they would talk to each other in their native language over radios. And when the Japanese would hear their language, they wouldn't be able to tell what they were saying. It was a unbreakable language they couldn't figure out. And here's a video I'm going to show you about African American soldiers during World War II.
training camp of its kind in the world, 800 colored rookies get their basic physical build-up for eventful days to come. 10 weeks ago, they were coal miners, steel workers, mechanics, professional boxers. In fact, most everything from college teachers to Pullman porters. A few weeks more of this intensive drill, and they'll become the field artillery replacements of the famed 16th Battalion, a compact fighting force of cannoneers, radio and signalmen, an all-Negro group assembled from all over the nation, a well-trained unit ready and eager to join the fight for survival of the great democracy that gave them birth.
All right, men. On behalf of the United States Army, the reception center here at this camp, we're glad to welcome you here today and into the United States Army. We're glad to see all of your happy, smiling faces. You'll be converted from a civilian into a full-fledged soldier.
When I went in, they had a pad and eyes, Negro, hair, Negro, color, Negro, complexion, Negro, race, Negro. Everything was Negro except height and weight.
Despite the bravery of African Americans in all of America's previous wars, despite the argument made by the NAACP and others that a Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world, the armed forces of the United States remained strictly segregated. Black draftees from the North, sent to training camps in the Deep South, encountered Jim Crow laws for the first time. Some who defied those laws paid with their lives. Some men refused to serve in a segregated military and were imprisoned for it. At home and overseas, there were frequent and sometimes bloody confrontations between black servicemen and white civilians, black troops and white ones, over women and local customs and equal access to military facilities. Growing protest by African Americans would force the military to make a few changes. An Army Air Corps training camp was set up at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. A single ship, the USS Mason, was manned entirely by blacks, except for a commander. The 761st Tank Battalion would eventually fight in Europe, sent to the front by George Patton with the admonition, I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. The Marine Corps had refused to accept any blacks at all. But after 1942, as casualties in the Pacific mounted and pressure from civil rights groups intensified, John Gray and others were finally allowed to sign on and serve in segregated units.
They did not intend to have blacks as fighting units. They intended to have them, if at all, as support units. Look like you ought to appreciate the fact that you're not up front. But they didn't want you to get that kind of a glory.
Okay. Over 300,000 women also joined in the military, although women were confined to non-combat roles. Women would serve in all the different branches of the military, especially in administrative work. Here we can see some pilots. They were known as the WASPs, who would transport soldiers and material, and in some cases in very dangerous places, but they were not put in combat roles intentionally. With millions of people joining armed forces, that means that there's a lot of people needed to work in factories to make all the stuff for the war. And the government encouraged women to take these defense jobs. And so we see at this time many women abandoned what were called women's jobs at the time, and joined jobs that had been denied them in the past. There's an opportunity gap there where women were rarely given an opportunity to work in these high-paying, higher skilled defense jobs, and now with fewer men working at home, the government needs women to work in these positions. More women are working outside the home than ever before. Unfortunately, though, women working outside the homes in these higher paying, higher skilled jobs still face sexual harassment and still faced lower wages compared to their white coworkers or their male coworkers. This is a picture of Rosie the Riveter. I know you've probably seen the picture of the woman with the bandana on her head and she's flexing her muscle. If you went back to 1942 and you asked Americans who's Rosie the Riveter, I would say 95% of people would point to this picture of Rosie the Riveter. That famous picture was actually not famous during World War II. It was actually only in, I believe it was a couple factories in Oregon for only a couple months. And it only became a cultural icon later in I believe it was the 1980s through women's rights groups then. Okay, here you can see some real Rosie the Riveters. Okay, here's a woman working as a welder. Here you can see some pictures of women who are being encouraged to join by the government. Unfortunately, some of these, the ways that they're asking women to do it is, I would argue, also demeaning towards women. Like this one saying that he's voicing saying we never figured you could do a man-sized job, and she's like ready to slap him in the face. Or this one, longing won't bring him back sooner, get a war job. Okay, secretaries of war, soldiers without guns. Okay, so women are needed in this war effort. But again, it's 1940, and some of the ways they are encouraging women are not exactly empowering. And here's some women working in a metal fabrication company right next door in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. For African American civil rights leaders back on the home front, there's an increased push for civil rights called the Double V campaign. V was used a lot during World War II as reference to victory. And so if there's a double V, a double victory, that means victory over Nazism and victory against racism at home. So two types of victories are required. The argument was made, and you heard it in the video, how can a country fight against a fascist, racist government in Europe while we still have systemic racism, discrimination at home? Activists want to get rid of discrimination in defense jobs and defense factories. Roosevelt doesn't want to push that. And so some Black leaders threatened to march on Washington. And so to avoid this, President Roosevelt issues an executive order getting rid of job discrimination in defense factories based on race. However, this did not desegregate the military. Unfortunately, in war effort positions, Mexican Americans still face job discrimination, specifically in farming jobs in Southwest United States. We had talked about in the Great Depression era that thousands of Mexican Americans had been deported. Even legal citizens had been deported. However, through the World War II effort, there is a desire for more farm workers, and so the government creates something called the Bracero program, and the Bracero program said that they were going to bring thousands of Mexican immigrants back to the United States to meet wartime labor demands. Unfortunately, they were paid very little and treated poorly by landowners. In these factories, labor unions would grow. 15 million more workers joined labor unions compared to in the Great Depression, when that number dropped dramatically. However, union leaders said that they made a deal and said basically they were not going to go on a strike for the war because that would hurt the war effort, as kind of a deal with employers that they would make good working conditions and good wages for the workers. At the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, the government passed a law designed to help returning veterans. It was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or more well known as the GI Bill. This GI Bill is supposed to help soldiers to reacclimate them to society, provide education, job training, pensions, home loans. But we'll get into some problems of the GI Bill when we get to our next chapter. The GI Bill was not always fair in its implementation, especially for veterans or people of color. Now, FDR already ran for 3 terms as president. He is now going for 4 terms as president in 1944. And he wins his 4th election. For Americans on the home front, they had to take on wartime responsibilities. They joined civilian defense committees. They recycled. They rationed. Many Americans built victory gardens in their yard, and the thought is not to grow food and send it to soldiers. The idea is grow your own food, eat that food, and then you don't have to buy food from the grocery store. Because just like in World War I, the fear is if everyone's buying food plus the government is buying food to send to soldiers and our allies, that the price would increase so much it would lead to inflation that could hurt our economy. And so the government wants inflation to stay low. So it asks people basically to buy less and to save more. So it asks people to save metal, it save rubber. I'll go back. We'll play this video for you. This is a good one.
As the country mobilized for total war, Americans at home were asked by their government to do without most of the luxuries and many of the necessities they had begun to take for granted. Everything seemed to be rationed or in short supply. Gasoline and fuel oil and rubber, bobby pins and zippers and tin foil, shoes and whiskey and chewing gum, butter and coffee and nylons and tomato ketchup and sugar, canned goods and cigarettes, and the matches needed to light them.
I guess the deep down feeling I had is that they made us sacrifice. And if we were sacrificing, we would somehow feel closer to the war effort. And I think that's really what they were trying to do, was to get your attitude in that our fighting men and women don't have these, so you shouldn't have these, and somehow you'll get tied into the war effort.
We did without during the Depression, so doing without these commodities really was not hard. Recipes were adjusted according to what you could get. Now, there were shortages all over. You could get very little white flour. Cakes were all adjusted to no sugar, very little fat or shortening of any sort. So cakes took it as hard as anything. To have a birthday cake was a real treat because it meant they had to save everything to make one cake.
Look, miss, see that? You could drive a car from Los Angeles to New York with the gas that plane burns up in just 1 hour of combat. It takes 2 million gallons of gas to send a single 1,000-bomber raid over enemy territory. That's enough to drive 1,000 private automobiles 7,500 miles a year for 4 years. Now, where would you rather see that no gas sign? At his station or here?
But many people tried to get around rationing. And a thriving black market grew up to satisfy those who couldn't do without. According to one study, 1 in every 4 retail transactions during the war was illegal.
What is there we can all do on the home front to help the men coming back and the men still over there? Make your home an arsenal for victory by fighting waste every day from now until the war is over. 1, don't waste anything. 2, buy only what is necessary. 3, salvage what you don't need. 4, share what you have.
The old iron beds were pulled out of the garages and they were put in the metal drives. The Boy Scouts did a great deal of that. The city took up the old streetcar lines that went down Government and Dolphin Street. And we added those to the scrap pile. But everyone took part in World War II, down to the youngest child.
The Office of Civilian Defense called upon each American family to become a fighting unit on the home front. Everyone was asked to collect scrap metal from which armaments could be made. In 1 year alone, Mobile's citizens amassed 22 million pounds. Children were the most avid collectors.
The motto was wash and squash. You wash out the can, and then you're taking the top off, and then you take the bottom off, and then you put the top and the bottom together in the middle, and then you squash it, you stomp on it. And then you put these in a box, and then, I don't know if it was every week or every other week, the city would come by and they would pick up, you'd set them out on your curb, kind of like recycling now. And then the city would come by and they'd pick up all these tin cans.
In Sacramento, 22 big victory bins were set up on downtown street corners for the duration, even though some people thought they were unsightly. Laverne, Minnesota, had been founded by Civil War veterans. But now, the town council volunteered to melt down the cannonballs that formed part of the memorial to the Union dead to make munitions for the new conflict. And in Waterbury, Connecticut, 281,135 pounds of tin were collected, along with 65,000 pounds of rubber, 225,458 pounds of rags, and 372,733 pounds of fat.
If you were lucky enough to get a pound of bacon, for example, and you get the fat in there, you were supposed to pour that into a tin can and then take it down to the salvage guy. Now, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how are they going to make ammunition out of bacon fat.
All of this we knew made ammunition, but we didn't know how. But anything to help the boys.
Fats make glycerin, and glycerin makes explosives. Every year, 2 billion pounds of waste kitchen fats are thrown away. Enough glycerin for 10 billion rapid-fire cannon shells. A belt 150,000 miles long, 6 times around the earth. A skillet of bacon grease is a little munitions factory.
Okay, there you go. These defense jobs become so important during World War II that they need to be able to run 24/7, 365 days a year. And there's a growing desire for these factories to be built in warmer climates. And so a lot of these factories began growing in Southwest United States, places like California and Arizona. And so many new migrants moved to these states. We have these cities that become boom towns with these huge factories providing jobs to thousands of new people. We see more diversity in workplace jobs, although in some states these jobs were segregated. Unfortunately, that also leads to more violence. One example of this is in Los Angeles. During this time period, male Mexican-American teenagers wore a fashion style at the time called the zoot suit. Now, while it was worn by some gangs at the time, it wasn't only gangs. In many cases, it was done by just teenage boys because it was a cool new outfit. And basically, it's like these flat pants and this long jacket. But to many adults, they falsely and wrongly believe that if you wore a zoot suit, you must be a part of a gang, that you must be violent. And at one point, there was a rumor that started up that a gang of Mexican-American boys beat up a white sailor. And so hundreds of white sailors began walking around Los Angeles, especially through a neighborhood that was mostly Mexican-American workers, and any young men who are wearing zoot suits could be attacked and beaten up. Clothes were torn, and eventually the city would outlaw zoot suits, even though zoot suits were not a sign that you participated in anything illegal. But this is an example of how these wartime cities often led to racial violence. These wartime migration in big cities also created more opportunities for gay men and for women, especially in these factories, and more people coming to big cities who had once lived in small towns. Gay men began to meet other gay men with a lot higher population concentration, and these places would later be centers of gay rights movements that we'll be talking about in our next chapter. And while it was against the rules, and gay men and women could be kicked out, many still served in the military, unfortunately, having to hide a part of who they are. Now, in this war, we are fighting different countries who, at one time or another, had sent many immigrants to the United States: Germany, Italy, and Japan. There's really little antagonism towards German and Italian immigrants or people of German and Italian descent. However, that's not the same for people of Japanese ancestry. Instead, after Pearl Harbor, many Americans on the West Coast fear that Japanese Americans could either attack the United States through espionage, through spying, or could sabotage our factories or oil fields, and could help the Japanese if they would ever invade the United States. And so with these fears, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which forces Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, even citizens, into relocation camps so that they could be contained, and so that they would not pose a risk to the country. Now, this is obviously an action done by a fear, done by systemic racism. It's completely based off of their race. It included American citizens. Most of the people were actually born in the United States. Some of these 100,000 people were allowed to leave the internment camps to go to college. Initially, Japanese American men were not allowed to join the army to fight. Eventually, they were allowed to fight, but they could only fight in Europe, not against the Japanese. There really wasn't much protest or argument or resistance against this internment order. However, it did go to the Supreme Court, and in Korematsu versus United States, which is very important, the Supreme Court allowed this removal, but did not answer whether it was constitutional or not. They kind of punted, arguing that it's a wartime measure. Here you can see some pictures. This is a Japanese owned business arguing that they're an American. Here you can see terrible things written about Japanese Americans. Here is a group of Japanese Americans being sent off. Here's one example of a camp. And this is a group of Japanese American men, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, who fought bravely in northern Italy. So we had talked about how we are fighting the war on the home front. We're going to quickly go over what the war was like in the actual battlefield. So we have our allies, Great Britain, United States, and Russia. The three agreed that Germany was the top priority. So that means that while the United States is fighting both Germany and Japan at the same time, Great Britain and Russia aren't going to do anything against Japan until Germany is defeated. I had mentioned before that Germany had invaded Russia, Russia immediately calls for the United States to start fighting in Europe to take pressure off of Russia, right? If we start invading France, then Germany's going to have to send soldiers there instead of just having to fight against Russia. But we are not ready for that yet. Here you can see leaders of the three countries: Joseph Stalin of Russia, Roosevelt of the United States, and Churchill of Great Britain. As you can see in this map, in 1942, the Allies are running into some major problems. Germany is fighting in Russia. Germany has invaded North Africa. U-boats are blowing up American ships in the Atlantic Ocean. But by 1943, things begin to turn. Russia wins the important Battle of Stalingrad, pushing the Germany back. Allies invade North Africa instead of going into France. Stalin is very mad about this, but America says we're not ready to attack France yet. We're just not prepared for that. So we go into North Africa first. Oops. We go to North Africa first, and then up Italy. So we take over Italy. We get rid of Mussolini. The fighting would slow when we get to northern Italy, and would be a fight for the rest of the war. So here's where America is, or where the war is, by April 1944. You can see America has taken over North Africa, the bottom half of Italy. Russia has begun to push back from Stalingrad, now back to their original borders. And America and Great Britain are here planning to invade France. And so on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, the Allies invade France on the peninsula of Normandy. The fighting would be devastating. However, America would get on land, creating a foothold, leading to thousands and thousands of men, material, tanks being unloaded to begin the war in France right there. Here you can see some soldiers on D-Day getting off these Higgins boats at the beach. I believe this is at Omaha Beach. And then here you can see just how many ships are unloading men and tanks and trucks, and all to fight the Nazis. Just a couple months later, America was able to expand enough to take over Paris. Then next month, they go north into Belgium. They do lose an important battle in Operation Market Garden. But by this time, our long-range bombers can hit Germany. And so we are inflicting very heavy civilian casualties through these bombing runs. Over 300,000 civilians would be killed. Germany does launch a final counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge before losing and Germany being pushed back to the point where they are completely surrounded by American, British, and Russian troops. Adolf Hitler commits suicide in 1945, and on May 7th, they finally surrender, leading us to what's called VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. When Allied troops made it to Poland, when Russian soldiers made it to Poland, they began finding extermination camps of the Holocaust. In these camps, over 6 million Jews and 6 million other people were killed, including Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, and other undesirables. People around the world knew that there was persecution going on. Not how bad it was. There's some debate over this, over what America could have done. But some examples of this, of this denial of Jewish citizens in the country, was a ship called the St. Louis. This is before America had joined the war. Had a bunch of Jewish refugees trying to flee Germany. They had stopped at multiple countries trying to get people off the ship and to safety. And each country they went to, including the US, said no. Those people were sent back, and I think about half of them were later killed in the Holocaust. In the Pacific, Japan, starts this whole war for America with Pearl Harbor. By 1942, they have a huge swath of land. You can see this red shape. That's all the land they control. And so the United States is going to launch 2 simultaneous attacks towards Japan. You can see going up this way through this blue arrows and then these blue arrows. And they're using a tactic called island hopping. Make sure you write that down. Basically, you don't just take all of your men and you go right towards Japan. You go and attack each of these little islands. You get closer and closer and closer, because each time you take over islands, now you can use that as a base to attack the next island. It'd be way too hard to take your entire invasion force on one big trip to Japan. It's much easier to take smaller steps to get there. We don't need to know like which islands they took over or anything like that. But when we do get closer, America starts bombing raids over Japan, killing hundreds of thousands of citizens. You see some famous pictures. In 1945, though, before Germany would surrender, President Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. So his vice president, Harry S. Truman, was sworn in president, and he learned about a new weapon that had been developed over the course of the war called the atomic bomb, developed by a secret government group, the Manhattan Project. Truman ordered these 2 atomic bombs to be dropped immediately. They were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The belief was that this would end the war quicker and that America would not have to invade the Japanese homeland. Japanese cities were destroyed. Tens of thousands of people are killed. And after these 2 bombs, Japan unconditionally surrenders. bombs. Here you can see, I believe this is from Hiroshima, the city completely devastated. More than 50 million soldiers and civilians were killed during the course of this war. 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Over 100 million people are wounded. 30 million or so are homeless. Cities around the world lay in ruins. Over 400,000 Americans are killed. And many more problems are going to rise out of the war. We'll talk about those next time. If you have any questions, please let your teacher know. Thank you.